The American Civil War wasn't just a clash of armies on blood-soaked fields. It was a war won and lost in the shadows too, where scraps of information, hurried sketches, and desperate dispatches could shift the entire tide of battle before a single shot was fired. Generals rose and fell not only on their courage or their numbers, but on something quieter, something sharper, the ability to see what the enemy couldn't, to know what he didn't want you to know. So, when we ask who was the smartest Civil War general, we're not just talking about the ones who charged the hardest or quoted Napoleon the loudest. We're talking about the one who understood that knowledge itself was the ultimate weapon. But before we begin, support the community, like and subscribe. Most people point straight to Robert E. Lee or Ulysses S. Grant. Lee, with his audacious maneuvers that left larger Union forces stumbling in the dust of Virginia. Grant grinding down the Confederacy through sheer relentless will until Appomattox. Both brilliant in their ways. But if you dig past the famous charges and the surrender ceremonies, if you look at what actually let an army move with precision instead of tripping over its own confusion, one name starts to stand out in a way that changes the whole picture. William Starke Rosecrans, Old Rosy to his men, a West Pointer who turned engineering into something almost prophetic on the battlefield. Body. To get why Rosecrans mattered so much, you have to step back into the early days of the war, when military intelligence was barely more than rumor and guesswork. Scouts rode out and came back with stories that might be true, might be planted. Cavalry patrols clashed in the woods, grabbing a prisoner here or a newspaper there. Signal stations waved flags across hills, hoping the message got through without being intercepted. Civilian informants whispered what they'd seen, but who could trust them? Commanders often operated half-blind, issuing orders based on maps that were outdated or contradictory. Entire divisions could march into traps because one corps commander had a different sketch of the terrain than another. It wasn't just inefficient, it was deadly. Rosecrans saw this problem early, and he didn't just complain about it, he fixed it. Before the war, he'd been a civil engineer, a man who understood roads, rivers, railroads, and how the land itself could dictate victory or defeat. He knew maps weren't luxuries, they were lifelines. And in an era when photography was still a novelty, still something people associated with portraits rather than warfare, Rosecrans had an idea that sounds almost modern. Why hand-draw maps that varied from unit to unit, full of errors and inconsistencies? Why not photograph a master map, create identical copies, and get them into every commander's hands before the first bugle sounded? He made it happen. In the Army of the Cumberland, his engineers would scout ahead, sketch the ground, every ridge, every ford, every rail line, every farmhouse that could hide an ambush. Then a photographer traveling with the Army would capture that master map on glass plates. Prints were made quickly, distributed to every brigade and division commander. Corrections from the field came back, new plates were shot, and updated versions went out the same way. No more guessing if your neighbor's map matched yours. Everyone saw the same picture. Coordination became possible in a way it simply hadn't been before. This wasn't some minor staff tweak, it was revolutionary. For the first time in American warfare, a commanding general had turned intelligence into a system, gathered, analyzed, standardized, and pushed forward to the men who needed it most. Scouts, spies, escaped slaves, intercepted letters, cavalry reports, even newspapers from behind enemy lines. All of it fed into a process that let Rosecrans see the battlefield not as a fog, but as a map he could read better than his opponent. Other generals had intelligence operations, sure. George Sharp built a solid bureau for the Army of the Potomac later on, pulling together all source reports that helped at Gettysburg. But Sharp was a staff officer, not the man holding the reins of an entire army in the field. Rosecrans was both. He commanded and he innovated at the same time. That combination made him different. Let's go back to where it all started for him. Born in Ohio in 1819, Rosecrans came up the hard way on a frontier farm, but he had a mind that wouldn't quit. West Point in 1842, fifth in his class. He could have stayed in the regular army, but he resigned after a dozen years to chase engineering projects, building roads, bridges, coal oil refineries. When the war broke out, he answered the call again, serving first under McClellan in Western Virginia. There, in the mountains, he already showed the traits that would define him: meticulous planning, a refusal to waste lives, and that engineer's eye for terrain. He won at Rich Mountain in 1861, a small but clean little victory that opened the way for Union control of the region. McClellan got the credit and the promotion, but Rosecrans had done the work. Transferred west, he took over after some early stumbles and steadied the Army of the Mississippi. At Iuka and Corinth in 1862, he beat Confederate forces that thought they had him outmaneuvered. At Stones River over New Year's 1862-63, his men fought one of the bloodiest stalemates of the war, but Rosecrans held the field. His troops loved him for it. They saw a commander who rode among them under fire, who seemed to know every inch of ground, who cared about getting them through alive. One Indiana soldier wrote that Rosecrans was as brave as Julius Caesar, but smarter about the cost. By the spring of 1863, he commanded the Army of the Cumberland, facing Braxton Bragg's Army of Tennessee across a rugged stretch of Middle Tennessee. Washington was impatient. Lincoln wanted movement. Rosecrans had been stalling, gathering supplies, perfecting his maps, drilling his men. Critics called him overly cautious. But when he finally moved on June 23, 1863, what followed was one of the most brilliant campaigns of the entire war. The Tullahoma Campaign. 9 days, barely 400 Union casualties, and the Confederates driven out of Middle Tennessee all the way back to Chattanooga without a major battle. How did he do it? Intelligence and deception, pure and simple. Rosecrans had his maps. He knew the gaps in the Cumberland Plateau like the back of his hand. He feinted hard on his right, drawing Bragg's attention toward Shelbyville. Meanwhile, his real thrust went through the left, through Hoover's Gap and Liberty Gap, places Bragg's cavalry had failed to scout properly. Rosecrans had equipped one of his brigades, John Wilder's Lightning Brigade, with Spencer repeating rifles, 7-shot repeaters that gave them firepower no one else could match on horseback or on foot. They seized the gaps before the Confederates could react. Rain turned the roads to mud, but Rosecrans had planned for it. Supply wagons moved anyway. His engineers bridged streams on the fly. Bragg, short on reliable cavalry intelligence thanks to some disastrous raids by his own horsemen, never quite grasped what was happening until it was too late. Rosecrans slipped divisions around his flanks, threatened his supply lines, forced him to abandon position after position. Tullahoma itself fell, almost without a fight. By July 3rd, the same day Gettysburg and Vicksburg were sealing other fates, Rosecrans had maneuvered Bragg out of a huge swath of territory with almost no bloodshed. Historians who study it call it a masterpiece of operational art. Deception, logistics, speed, all flowing from superior knowledge of the ground. One Union cavalryman later said if you wanted to study a model campaign, just take Rosecrans' orders and a good set of maps. It was the high point, and it proved the intelligence system worked. Identical maps meant every corps commander knew exactly where the others were supposed to be. No friendly fire from crossed orders, no wasted marches down dead-end roads. The Army moved like a single machine. But wars don't let you stay on top forever. That same summer, Rosecrans pushed on toward Chattanooga. He took the city almost without firing a shot, another feat of maneuver. Bragg retreated into Georgia, but then turned and struck back at Chickamauga in September. The battle that followed is where Rosecrans' story takes its tragic turn. On the second day, a misunderstood order opened a gap in the Union line. Longstreet's Confederates poured through. Parts of the Army routed. Rosecrans himself was swept back toward Chattanooga in the confusion. He sent one of his staff officers, James Garfield, back to the front to rally the troops. Garfield found George Thomas holding the line like a rock, the Rock of Chickamauga. And the Union survived to fight another day. But the damage was done. Rosecrans had been in the wrong place at the wrong moment. Critics, especially Grant, who took over the theater soon after, painted him as hesitant, rattled, finished. Was it fair? Chickamauga was a bloody mess for everyone. Rosecrans had been pressing the offensive aggressively until that moment. His intelligence had gotten the Army to the battlefield in the first place. But perception in war is everything, and Grant's version stuck. Rosecrans was relieved. He spent the rest of the war in quieter commands out west, never again at the center of things. After the war, he served as a congressman, minister to Mexico, and tried his hand at business again. He died in California in 1898. Largely forgotten by the public that once cheered him. Yet, if you measure smartness not by final victory parades but by the ideas that outlasted the man, Rosecrans stands taller than his reputation suggests. His photographic map system didn't die with his command. It spread. By war's end, standardized, reproducible maps became standard practice across Union armies. It was the seed of modern military intelligence, gathering from every source, analyzing it centrally, pushing actionable knowledge to the lowest levels that needed it. Long before the CIA or the Pentagon's J2 shops, Rosecrans had built something that looked a lot like them in miniature. He understood that in an age of mass armies and vast theaters, the general who saw clearest would win. Compare him to the legends. Lee was a tactical magician, but his intelligence often relied on Jeb Stuart's cavalry rides that sometimes left him guessing at the worst moments, Gettysburg being the most painful example. Grant was a strategic bulldog, relentless and clear-eyed about the big picture. But his early campaigns in the West showed the same fog of war problems everyone else faced, until systems like Rosecrans's improved things. Sherman grasped total war, breaking the South's will as much as its armies, but even he leaned on good scouts and local knowledge rather than inventing new ways to distribute it. Nathan Bedford Forrest was a cavalry genius who lived by raid and reconnaissance, but he operated on instinct more than system. Stonewall Jackson's Valley Campaign was brilliant, but it was short, localized, and dependent on his own eccentric habits. None of them built an intelligence apparatus that changed how whole armies operated. Rosecrans did, and he did it while commanding one of the biggest armies in the field, in some of the toughest terrain the war offered. Tullahoma wasn't flashy. It didn't produce a Gettysburg or a Vicksburg headline, but it showed what smart generalship could look like when brains and preparation met the chaos of war. Minimal losses, maximum results, an enemy outthought rather than outfought. Of course, no general is perfect. Rosecrans could be prickly with superiors. He worried details that sometimes slowed him. At Chickamauga, the fog closed in on him too, But intelligence isn't about never making mistakes. It's about stacking the odds before the fight starts. Rosecrans stacked them higher than most. In my view, that makes him the smartest Civil War general, not the most famous, not the one with the most statues, but the one whose ideas quietly reshaped how modern armies think about seeing the battlefield. The war ended with Grant and Sherman in the spotlight, Lee in dignified defeat. But the real revolution, the one that turned information into victory, traced back to a careful engineer from Ohio who refused to let his army march blind. Next time you look at a Civil War map, crisp and clear with every road marked, remember who first made sure every commander carried the same one. That's the kind of smart that wins wars, even if history books sometimes forget to say the same.